behind it.
You think if I'm planning to come rob this cannabis stop, which you're insinuating, I'm going to show up with all this equipment in the middle of broad daylight?
I'm just asking a simple question.
You know what? That's a foolish way to think. I'm not even going to entertain that question.
No?
No.
So what's the purpose of the cameras?
To take pictures and video.
For what purpose?
For whatever purpose I choose. What do you mean?
Suddenly, the police move in.
The sun rises quietly over Peaceful Valley, a small town brushed in the appearance of calm, civility, and the veil of routine rural life. But beneath the surface, as this Bodycam footage reveals, are fault lines shaped by unchecked authority, deeply rooted mistrust, and a community that clashes with its own protectors. In this town, one man and a camera become more than a nuisance. They become a threat. Not because he wields power, but because he refuses to relinquish his rights. It starts unassumingly. A man named Ethan, camera in hand, is seen calmly walking through downtown, capturing scenes from Main Street in broad daylight. He's not wielding a sign, he's not blocking traffic, he's not confronting passers-by. He's merely observing, filming, documenting. But for some, documentation itself is provocation. Even in these early moments, layers of tension ripple beneath the dialogue. Locals seem unsettled by the camera's presence. Their objections are vague, their concerns unmapped. But the recurring sentiment is clear. Why are you filming? The question may seem harmless, but in context, it becomes a demand, an insistence that Ethan explain, justify, and perhaps apologize for exercising a constitutionally protected act. From the outset, the fear of transparency is unmistakable. When a citizen filming public buildings and sidewalks draws suspicion, it reveals something deeper than discomfort. It reveals a system allergic to scrutiny. Ethan isn't simply being asked a question. He's being interrogated before any legal threshold of suspicion has been met. Then the escalation begins. At 3:02, officers arrive and initiate an inquiry, anchoring their presence in vague community concerns and recent reports. The officer leads with a mention of prior thefts and the implication, thinly veiled, that filming a cannabis store could be part of criminal planning. Here the power dynamic sharpens. The officer doesn't directly accuse Ethan, but the insinuation is laced into the conversation. Asking why someone is filming in a legally protected public space becomes a mechanism, not of curiosity, but of control. The mere act of recording now carries the burden of suspicion, even accusation. It's a familiar maneuver employed throughout countless encounters across the country. When authority senses discomfort from visibility, it repositions public rights as potential threats. Ethan, without raising his voice or breaking civil conduct, rejects the implication outright. This is the first clear moment where power begins to shift, not by force, but by clarity. He challenges the assumption that a man with a camera must be doing something wrong. He refuses to validate the incorrect logic that camera equals crime in progress. His reasoning is sound, and more importantly, it's lawful. The psychological significance of this moment hinges not on the officer's words, but his reaction. Here we see the subtle transformation of posture. Authority steps forward, but retreats almost imperceptibly when its assertion is met with assertive legality. Ethan's calm refusal unseats the informal tribunal being crafted before him. He isn't confrontational, he's constitutional. But Peaceful Valley's guardians don't yield easily. Another officer enters, and here the language and strategy shifts yet again. And there's an immediate attempt to link Ethan and his actions to others allegedly seen filming municipal locations. This is a classic maneuver in escalation psychology. Even without evidence or identification, the officer introduces guilt by pattern, attempting to anchor Ethan's presence in vague, suspicious activity reports from days past. But Ethan breaks that maneuver where it stands. He wasn't there, he states. He's not linked to those incidents. In doing so, he surgically separates himself from the fog of suspicion designed to confuse the boundaries of action and intent. Once again, the officer is checked, not aggressively, but constitutionally. From 4AG to 440, the conversation crescendos into a confrontation of attitudes. The officer's stance tightens. They request Ethan's name. Ethan refuses, and legally he's entitled to. Unless there's reasonable suspicion that Ethan has committed, or is about to commit a crime, as required under Terry v. Ohio, he is under no obligation to identify himself. This legal reality collides with the officer's expectations, and once again, the encounter becomes more about control than conduct. The officer reveals subtle frustration. He pushes. Ethan pushes back, not physically, not abrasively, but with the quiet force of lawful resistance. The irony, of course, is that Ethan is not breaking the law. The officers, however, are beginning to drift perilously close to violating it. This is where Section 242 of Title 18 of the U.S. Code becomes critically relevant. This federal statute makes it a crime for a person acting under the color of law, the protection, influence, or appearance of authority, to willfully deprive someone of their rights. Each moment the officer insists on identification, implies wrongdoing, or makes veiled threats without clear, reasonable suspicion, the possibility of a 242 violation inches closer. But Ethan is not simply defending himself. He is also educating. Between 5 acts and 6 act, his dialogue becomes instructive, but not in the way critics claim auditors often provoke. He acknowledges what would have been a better lawful procedure, a simple drive-by, a neutral observation, followed by unbiased engagement. Ethan outlines this not as a demand, but as a pathway to de-escalation, to mutual respect, to constitutional integrity. But the officer resists, reverting again to community fear, complaint calls, and the unspoken premise that public discomfort justifies infringement on personal rights. This is critical because public complaint, no matter how emotional or persistent, does not grant probable cause. And here's where institutional failure quietly enters the frame. The officer conflates concern with criminality. Citizens calling to express suspicion about someone with a camera do not meet legal thresholds. Officers are not empowered to override the Constitution because someone felt uncomfortable. But that's exactly what continually happens in quiet towns like Peaceful Valley, where unfamiliarity meets enforcement, and the Constitution becomes conditional on mood and misunderstanding. Between 6 and 7:30, we witness the entrance of a sergeant, and with him a different approach. He's calm, composed, cordial. There's a notable behavioral shift. Ethan notes this immediately. The quality of respect between a senior officer and a citizen becomes clear and professional. For the first time, mutual dialogue replaces tension. Ethan doesn't yield his rights. But the conversation now reflects what law enforcement should look like. Still, the damage is done. Ethan announces that he would have left already if not for the police presence, and now, to avoid the appearance of being coerced, he chooses to stay longer. This is both strategic and symbolic. When law enforcement exerts unjustified pressure, the only way to break its perception of dominance is to resist not physically, but with purposeful autonomy. The police have become the reason the gathering persists, a self-fulfilling justification echoing deeply in reverse logic. And then, Ethan makes the connection that reshapes the entire encounter. Calls to police about a man with a camera can and often do escalate beyond intimidation. He references previous moments where deliberately false calls, claiming threats or weapons, have endangered his safety. It's not just hypothetical, it's documented across the country. Swatting, false flagging. Dozens of auditors and photographers have endured it. What's unfolding in front of this Bodycam lens is no longer a disagreement. It's a cautionary tale stitched together by years of precedent, case law, systemic misconduct, and deep cultural misunderstanding between civilians and the enforcers paid to protect them. In most documentaries, resolution comes in the form of dialogue. Here, it comes in law, reasserted through clarity, persistence, and unwavering resolve. As the officers finally de-escalate and disengage, we see the uneasy quiet that follows overreach. The supervisors remain measured, but the system remains broken. Ethan may not have been arrested, but the psychological terrain he forced them to cross was not easily traversed. In Peaceful Valley, there was no weapon. There was no crime. And yet 3 officers, 2 marked cars, and a growing crowd coalesced around the gravitational pull of a single civilian with a camera. Because in today's America, it's not the presence of danger that frightens power, it's the presence of witnesses. And now Ethan's footage is leaving the streets behind and entering the court of public opinion. In part 2, this encounter scales beyond one incident, illustrating how power responds to exposure, and how small towns safeguard silence not through policy, but through habit, culture, and systemic comfort with unaccountable control. In part 1, we examined how a calm, lawful citizen with a camera disrupted a town's quiet assumptions about power and control. But what unfolds next in the footage pulls back the curtain even further. Not just on one encounter, but on a deeper culture that allows suspicion to be treated as guilt and authority to be enforced by routine rather than reason. What began as a sidewalk interaction now exposes the inner machinery of how law enforcement navigates public accountability, and how often it fails to uphold it. As we move into minute 8 of the video, something important happens. The presence of a law enforcement veteran, the sergeant, alters the temperature of the situation. His tone is less reactive, more measured. He understands something that his subordinate, Officer Belanger, did not. That public perception and legal integrity are linked. How you approach a citizen matters, not just for appearances, but for outcomes. And the outcome here is beginning to tilt. Ethan, who never raised his voice, never took an aggressive stance, has steadily gained narrative ground. Not because he shouted louder, but because he stayed inside the lines of the law while those enforcing them nearly stepped over. By 8 sec, the dialogue shifts into a more formalized standoff, tonally quiet, but legally significant. Ethan explains not only the law that protects his right to film in public, but also the real concern at the heart of his exercise. How dangerously easy it is for misinformation to trigger a deadly escalation. He mentions the risk of ramped-up calls, the community habit of inflating concerns to get a faster police response. He warns, astutely, that this chain of exaggeration can put people at risk, both civilians and police officers. This portion of the conversation is key because it illustrates the gap between perception and protocol. When a person calls in with a subjective fear, the dispatcher and the officers in the field must rely on judgment. When that judgment is bent by bias, fear, or rumor, the result can be fatal. We've seen this before in cases like Tamir Rice, John Crawford III, and Philando Castile, where misinformation reported through emergency services led to unnecessary and often tragic outcomes. These aren't historical tragedies of another era, and they are a direct consequence of what Ethan describes, the myth that safety must come by overreaction, not observation. By explaining this in real time, Ethan is again doing more than filming. He's issuing an audit, not of the officer's badge, but of the officer's behavior, motive, and institutional context. And the sergeant, to his credit, listens, at least on the surface. But posture matters. Look closely at the sergeant's body language, and you'll see subtle distinctions in how authority reasserts itself. His stance is passive but physically closer. His speech is measured but places the burden of cooperation subtly back on Ethan. At 9:00, he tells Ethan that out of respect, perhaps he should not film a business that doesn't want to be filmed. It sounds neutral, reasonable, even polite. But examine it more closely. It is a request based on appeasement, not law. The cannabis store has no legal basis to demand no filming from a public sidewalk. They operate in public commerce in a transparent, regulated industry. And still the officer leans toward deference to their discomfort rather than the citizen's lawful action. This contradiction, where public businesses are treated as private entities when they dislike visibility, is a recurring systemic failure in towns like Peaceful Valley. Ethan responds carefully, pointing out the double standard. How can a business claim a right to privacy on a public block with 5-foot glass windows, particularly when their own signage, branding, and location are inherently visible? It's a surgical rebuttal, and the officer folds under it. Public officials expressing a desire for respect is valid. But when that desire evolves into a request to limit protected behavior, like filming from a public sidewalk, it becomes a veiled attempt to restrict rights through social leverage rather than legal grounds. Still, this device is effective. Many citizens might accept the suggestion and move elsewhere. Ethan does not. And in his refusal, we see the deeper power at play, not just between police and public, but between authorities' expectations and one man's clarity. At 10:00, the sergeant returns to familiar ground. The community isn't used to someone filming outside. It's not something we normally see, he says, again attempting to alloy curiosity with caution. This admission is deeply instructive. What the officer is stating is not a legal principle. It's a cultural reflex. Unfamiliar behavior equals suspicious behavior. But the Constitution does not depend on familiarity. Rights are designed to protect unpopular acts and perspectives, expression, religion, protest, political belief. None are afforded fewer protections because they discomfort a majority. Yet in these small towns, law enforcement often adopts a popularity-based lens. What makes people most comfortable becomes the assumed status quo, and those who operate outside it, activists, auditors, press, protesters, are treated as irritants or threats by default. This is the quiet danger of normalized overreach. You cannot prevent rights from being exercised simply because the exercise is uncommon. Yet this principle still does not appear to be internalized fully in Peaceful Valley. Then at 11:15, the sergeant asks something important, though perhaps unintentional. What would you have done if you didn't want to answer our questions? Again, it sounds like curiosity, maybe even sincerity, but the subtext is troubling. It implies a conditional tolerance for rights. You're allowed to say no, but we might not like it. This isn't legal doctrine, it's social policing. Ethan responds directly. He would have simply declined to speak, calmly, quietly, as is his right. The sergeant nods, perhaps the only correct reaction available in that moment. But it reveals a deeper pattern. Throughout the footage, Ethan is not just standing firm on his own rights. He's having to educate those tasked with protecting them. That contradiction between citizen knowledge and officer assumption is the true fulcrum of this documentary. As the video enters its final progression, between 12 acts and 14:1, the conversation returns to systemic stakes. Ethan's argument is elevated now. He points out that law enforcement's worst enemy isn't civilians with cameras. It's bad cops going unchecked. The message is direct. When good officers stay silent while bad ones abuse power, the system fails from within, and the consequences are profound, financially, socially, legally. He urges the officers to course correct, not out of confrontation, but professional self-interest. If departments want safer working conditions, fewer civil suits, better community relations, they must address misconduct early and directly, not silently, not privately. The locker room talk tactic sounds diplomatic, but it's often a euphemism for avoidance. True accountability cannot be selectively applied. What Ethan is articulating here is a civilian version of the blue wall of silence. He's calling it out openly, directly to the officers' faces, and crucially, they don't deny it. There's a subtle shift. They agree in theory, but agreement isn't action. Still, this sequence is the moral nucleus of the interaction. A turning point, not in tone but in truth. Ethan is not adversarial, he's systemic in his thinking. He understands that what happens in this small moment matters far beyond it. That what people excuse today becomes normalized tomorrow. And while no physical incident occurs, no arrest, no detainment, the abuse here is procedural. It is an education in how free people are trained, by culture, by tone, by posture, not to act free. This is the silent battle happening in towns like Peaceful Valley. Not against rights on paper, but against the quiet, smiling suggestion that perhaps rights shouldn't be exercised too loudly. Toward the end of the Bodycam, around 15 check, the tone eases. Mutual cordiality is reestablished. The initial tension decays into closing pleasantries. Ethan says he'll continue filming for a while to avoid the perception of defeat. The police withdraw, but the encounter, like so many others, leaves deep residue. The truth is, Peaceful Valley didn't erupt because of Ethan. It revealed itself through him. His camera didn't incite violence. It recorded restraint. It documented subtle coercion, softened by politeness. It picked up passive language structured to produce compliance. And if Ethan hadn't known his rights, hadn't stood firm on doctrine, hadn't called out the buried tactics of soft-coded control, this story might have ended very differently. As Part 2 closes, new cracks appear beneath this town's image of order. Because order isn't stability when it depends on silence. It isn't justice when it pivots on intimidation. Peaceful Valley is just one town. But in its officers' words, its citizens' calls, and its conduct under pressure, we see the echo of a national pattern, how systemic power thrives not on dominance, but on deference mistaken for peace. As we enter part 3, we confront the broader implications, how footage like Ethan's reshapes institutional complicity, and what accountability might really look like when the public stops accepting polite suppression as civil order. The final act of this Bodycam encounter unfurls, not in confrontation, but in conversation. And yet, within that conversation lies the most revealing truth of all. By this point, the interaction has moved from tense standoff to what appears to be a polite parting of ways. The officers seem relaxed. The immediate threat of unlawful retaliation has faded. And yet, embedded in these last minutes, particularly between 15 Ets and 18 Sec, is a sobering clarity. Everything that needed to be shown has already occurred. The language of enforcement, the culture of quiet coercion, the double standards on constitutional rights, all of it. But what remains in this extended closing is perhaps the most dangerous habit of all: the institutional ability to normalize misconduct by smoothing rough edges. From nearly every angle, what Ethan captured cannot be undermined by physical violence or explosive drama. This is a new form of overreach, subtle, socially acceptable pressure applied through tone, presence, and implication. The Bodycam itself unwittingly confirms this truth. It records a conversation that may sound respectful, even friendly, but which is loaded with institutional expectations that the public not test their freedoms too boldly. At around 15:50, we hear Ethan say something with gravity. "Honor your oath." He doesn't yell it. He doesn't weaponize it. He says it plainly, and it echoes with weight. Because it's a reminder not just of what these officers are failing to do, but of what institutions try to forget: that the Constitution is not optional on difficult days. It doesn't give space for misinterpretation because someone felt uncomfortable. It doesn't bend around local customs or small-town suspicion. That simple statement is a knife through the heart of institutional amnesia. The officers nod. They agree. But agreeing doesn't repair the systemic rot that enables moments like this to occur at all. Earlier in the footage, when the call came in reporting men with cameras, nobody questioned the caller's motives. Nobody verified whether the complaint was fabricated, exaggerated, or maliciously filed. The officers didn't inquire why the video threatened anyone. They responded not to fact, but to perception. And in doing so, they brought the full weight of law enforcement presence to bear on citizens engaged in lawful activity. Now as they withdraw, they try to walk this back. Not formally, but intuitively. They discuss HIPAA laws. They express empathy about the privacy concerns of medical marijuana patients. These are real considerations. But they're also unrelated to the legal right to film from public space. Once again, we see the system attempting to reframe its overstep as a mutual misunderstanding, as something that both parties now better understand. But Ethan isn't confused, and neither should we be. There was no legal justification for any aspect of this police response beyond the briefest inquiry. The fact that it stretched to 20 minutes, involved multiple officers and vehicles, and danced so closely to illegal detainment, all of it speaks to how easily rights erode in the absence of vigilance. We tend to believe that censorship, overreach, and state abuse always wear a recognizable face, one of aggression or violence or explicit tyranny. But what Ethan's footage shows is how much of it now wears a smile. One officer says, "I guess I understand where you're coming from." It's meant to resolve the tension, close the loop, affirm the citizen's point. But here again, there's a subtext that warrants scrutiny. Because to guess at someone's right is to miss the foundation of the oath entirely. This isn't about understanding rights. It's about enforcing them without prejudice or permission. A police officer is not there to validate whether a citizen's expression makes sense to the community. They are sworn to protect it, whether they agree with it or not. The erosion we witness in this footage doesn't stem from brutality. It stems from institutional preference, the inherent tendency to prioritize a business owner's comfort over a filmmaker's liberty. What's especially telling is how the officers, in the final minutes, gradually attempt to reposition themselves as allies. They speak sincerely about learning experiences, about perspective, about mutual understanding. And to their credit, this indicates a potential for growth. But it's not enough, because these gestures do not come after an apology. They follow a near infringement of rights, and they serve to cosmetically reapply public trust without addressing the erosion itself. Consider what would have happened if Ethan didn't know the law, if he hadn't referenced Glick versus Cunniff, if he hadn't calmly articulated Terry V's Ohio thresholds, if he hadn't understood Title 18, Section 242. Would this footage have ended with calm discussion? Or would it have turned, as it has in countless other cases, into arrest, into seizure of equipment, into retaliation? In that scenario, this body cam would record nothing more than another ambiguous encounter washed away by the local PIO, a matter of interpretation, a policy review, a training opportunity. Instead, because Ethan never relinquished control, never escalated, never stepped over the line, it becomes something else. Proof. Proof that even without violence, systems will fold against civil liberty the moment they're not actively constrained by law. Proof that officers will prioritize private business discomfort over public constitutional rights. Proof that institutional behavior adjusts only when confronted by informed, unyielding assertion. By the 1720, we reach an almost cinematic frame. Ethan holds up his camera to show that even standing still, he can legally point it directly through their storefront window and film anything visible from public space. And yet, he chooses not to. Not because the law prohibits it, but because he's already made the point, and because where the rule of law ends, character begins. This moment becomes a quiet declaration. This is what it means to know your rights, and also know how to wield them responsibly. From here, the final few statements from the officers frame one last attempt to reshape the narrative. He didn't want to deter customers, one says of the cannabis shop. He just wanted to protect his private patients. These justifications are perhaps sincere, but they're also revealing, because they expose how local businesses feel empowered not only to call the police on harmless behavior, but to expect compliance. And they often get it. Citizens willing to push back are rare. And that rarity is what sustains systems like the one in Peaceful Valley. Systems where officers act informally on behalf of those they know, those who complain, those deemed socially important, rather than purely according to law. But no social bias can withstand documentation, which is why footage like Ethan's matters. It isn't just a digital record. It's a civic hammer, striking the surface of institutional habit, cracking it, testing it, measuring its resistance to reform. His presence didn't destabilize Peaceful Valley. It revealed its natural state when observed openly. In these final seconds, as Ethan walks away, no citation is given, no arrest is made, no handcuffs applied. But the power dynamic in the town has shifted forever. Not because the department changed, but because the people watching did. The video spreads across platforms, re-uploaded, studied, analyzed. Other auditors pick it up. Law students reference it. Civil rights groups include it in training seminars. And suddenly, Peaceful Valley's resistance to scrutiny becomes the evidence of its necessity. Ethan, of course, knows this. But he also knows that moments like these are fragile. Victory is temporary. And power often shifts quietly back the moment attention fades. So he doesn't celebrate. He doesn't gloat. He simply continues filming. And that, more than anything, is what those in power fear. Because power depends not just on authority, but on isolation. It thrives when the record is lost, when the courtroom is empty, when the sidewalk isn't being filmed. So long as the camera stays on, the default advantage of abuse is neutralized. Which is why accountability doesn't emerge from policy. It emerges from exposure. Repeated, persistent, lawful exposure. And Ethan's story is now your story too. The final shot of the body cam, the quiet goodbye, the professional handshake, all of it is performative, built to suggest business as usual. But the viewer knows what really happened. Business as usual almost became a civil rights violation, and only because of one man and one camera did it stop short. So what now? In the broader ecosystem of police reform, officers like those in Peaceful Valley rarely face individual consequences. No officers will likely be disciplined from this encounter. No lawsuits will be filed. Training manuals will remain unchanged. But something did shift. It happened in the public square of viral awareness. In the legal discourse, this footage sparked. In the raised expectations of the next person who stands on that sidewalk with a camera unwilling to lower it. And on some level, the department knows this. That's why the conversation turned conciliatory. That's why smiles were offered. That's why the tone softened. The camera exposed something they didn't want shown, not violence or brutality, but habitual, unthinking assumption of control. And now suddenly, they no longer had control of the record or of the story. That power belonged to Ethan with the camera, and now it belongs to us with the facts. So as the lens finally powers off and the sidewalk scrolls slowly into the black, Peaceful Valley fades into memory. But the lesson carved from its streets lives on. Not every fight is won in court. Some are won in the moment you refuse to retreat. Some are won in 20 seconds of footage that can't be undone, reworded, or buried. Some are won by standing still with a camera, planted firmly in freedom, and daring the system to try and explain itself. This was more than footage. It was a reckoning.